Hi, I'm Becky at Markland. I'm an educational psychologist and I'm here to talk to you about ADHD. Now, as people working in education, I'm sure you've worked with many young people with ADHD before and have at least a broad idea of what that means. So what I'd like to do through this presentation is unpick that a bit further and get you thinking about your perspective and approach as educators. To do that, I will start by discussing current and common conceptualizations of ADHD. I'll then talk about ADHD within the context of neurodiversity. I'll then explore with you key elements often associated with ADHD, thinking about what this looks like in education. And I'll end by leaving you with a reflective activity to guide your own thinking about your work as educators and where you might like to take your practice. Now, a key thread for me within this is to discuss ADHD through a much more humanistic, person-centered and inclusive lens than it perhaps sometimes is. In order to do that, however, we'll first need to start with how ADHD is most commonly defined. So what is ADHD and how do we typically conceptualize it? Well, in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, ADHD is defined as a disorder and characterized by persistent inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity that interferes with an individual's functioning and is present from childhood. Now, this definition above very much aligns with what is broadly referred to as the medical model. And this viewpoint asserts that ADHD behaviours are abnormal and are the result of somatic, biological, genetic, or physical problems, and takes the view that they should be treated in a medical way. Now, supporters of the medical model often point out that ADHD has genetic heritability, and studies have found differences in the brain structure of individuals with this diagnosis. And it's proposed by some that these differences lead to what they would describe as an impairment in key executive functioning skills, such as impulse control and focused attention. However, this perspective isn't universal, and critics of this medical approach claim that it's what they would say is reductionist. In other words, it takes a complex human phenomenon and tries to explain it away in simple and unhelpful terms. Beyond that, a medical approach doesn't consider other factors at play, such as the environment, personality differences, or early life experiences. Additionally, it's argued that the deficit approach can perpetuate a view of ADHD as being an illness or a disorder, and in other words, a problem. Now, critics of the medical model, they don't tend to dispute that there may be differences in brain structure and neurochemistry. However, rather than framing these differences as a problem, they argue that this can instead be viewed as a natural variation in human experience. So the neurodiversity approach then suggests that any differences in behaviour or brain structure lie on a spectrum of human diversity, and they shouldn't be considered problematic or pathological. And this aligns with what we call the social model of disability, which states that individuals with ADHD don't have an impairment necessarily, but are instead disabled by systemic barriers and societal attitudes held by others. In other words, a person with ADHD is only limited by the context around them and whether it enables individual diversity to flourish or not. Now, this is an important point, as by focusing on a child's weaknesses rather than the limitations of the context, we can easily ignore their strengths. When a child's not given opportunity to have their strengths acknowledged and are viewed as deficient in their skills, there are inevitably negative effects on their well-being, their self-esteem, their motivation, and their academic achievement. For example, in a study by Fleming, they found that when compared to their peers, children with ADHD had higher rates of unauthorised absence. They were more likely to be excluded from school, more likely to achieve lower academic attainment scores, are more likely to leave school early, as well as more likely to have higher rates of unemployment in adulthood. Now, it would be all too easy to say that this is because they simply don't have the skills that others do. And again, we could revert to deficit thinking. But we all have things that we're better at, and we all have things that we find harder. But for many people, the things that they're good at are the things that we prioritise within education, while for others, they might be good at things that we don't prioritise. And again, you can only be as successful as your environment permits you to be. So while there exists a group of individuals who do show the criteria described in the DSM-5, such characteristics are not necessarily pathological, and they may just be part of the normal distribution of behaviour. They may only be deemed to be deficits because they don't fit in with the expected norms within education. Now, as much as we talk about celebrating difference and neurodiversity in schools, we're not quite at the point in education where we have fully embedded that in principle. Instead, the deficit model is much more rife in education. For instance, it's standard practice in schools to try and identify what a student can't do and look for actions to address this. We often move to conversations around what strategies we can put in place to make a child fit the context that we've created, or wonder about how we can help them cope with the context, which is very different from creating a context where they can thrive. Now, this isn't surprising. It's very human to want shortcuts. We'd much rather have something quick and easy that we can do rather than be tasked with dismantling entire educational systems that have been around for hundreds of years. You know, it's common for us to want someone to say, do you know what, here, look, I've got some magic fixes that will help make your life really easy. You don't have to change much, just whack in these strategies and everything will be great. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. And as much as we'd like to think that there is someone out there who has the magic recipe, they don't. And I would say the number one thing that us as EPs are asked for whenever we deliver training on anything is practical strategies. Whatever the focus, whatever the need, staff will often ask us, can we have practical strategies to support these young people? And I'm going to be really honest, if there existed a list of foolproof, indisputable strategies that worked for all young people with ADHD all of the time, you would have it already. I can promise you there's no professional who's hiding information from you. We're not hoarding pieces of advice. We're not refusing to give anything out. In fact, the things that we tend to tell you, you've likely heard before. Because the simple truth is humans are complicated. What works once for one child won't necessarily work for another, and may not even work a second time for the same child. Humans aren't that predictable. We're actually very temperamental, and our responses to things is often influenced by hundreds of factors. So I would go so far as to say that the person who operates like clockwork is arguably the most divergent amongst humans. So if you've got someone who gets up at 5 a.m. every day to go to the gym without fail, or that person who sees their New Year's resolutions beyond February, fair play to them, well done, congratulations. But they're certainly in the minority of people that I know. Most people are often way less predictable when it comes to responding to systems and structures that we put in place. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's nothing that we can do for children with ADHD in school. Of course we can, but it means we can't just tell you what to do. The doing can't be provided in a simple list. So deciding what will be best for the young people you work with will always be an ongoing reflection and will necessitate change, adaptation, and active engagement from your part. It will never be a case of thinking about ADHD once and then being an expert on it forever. But one thing we can do is pay attention to the child's qualities and the characteristics overall. We can acknowledge that all qualities can be both strengths and weaknesses. And in the context of a classroom, we can think about how we can both support children with what they find harder and promote their strengths. In essence, we want to promote what we call positive education, which involves bringing out the best in every student, irrespective of hindrances. And this means paying purposeful attention to already well-functioning diverse skills, in addition to merely ameliorating problems. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, Beckett, we get it. ADHD is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that's simply a super cool part of human difference and diversity, and it's reductionist and short-sighted to try and simplify our approach into a contrived list of simple things we can do with little to no effort. Sure, but what do we do? And that's a fair question, and I don't want to leave you with no more than you had before. And while I can't give you anything easy, I think the key thing we can do is try and understand ADHD more. We can try and step into the world of a child with ADHD and think about how we work with it rather than change it. And to do that, I will try and break it down a little bit more by exploring with you common areas associated with ADHD, again, through a lens of neurodiversity and holding the human in mind. So the first thing we're going to talk about is attention style. Now you'll notice I've said attention style as opposed to attention difficulties or attention deficit. And that's because while the attention style of those with ADHD can make attending to some things harder, I still really want to hold in mind that it's an attention difference as opposed to inherently good or bad. It simply is. And when we say deficit, it's all too easy to believe that those with ADHD will have trouble attending to anything, which is a huge oversimplification. Often those with ADHD have a heightened form of attention. They may notice many things in the environment around them. They may be attending to multiple thoughts and ideas in their head at once. And they may also show what we call hyperfocus on tasks of particular interest, perhaps attending more so than the neurotypical peers even. Where difficulties may arise in the classroom is perhaps when they're tasked with sustaining attentional tasks that are a lot less engaging, or when having to do so for prolonged periods of time. Or they may have difficulty being able to switch their attention from the very interesting thoughts in their own head to something that somebody else has deemed the most important thing. It's common, therefore, for staff to observe children looking like they're not listening, like they're zoning out or daydreaming, getting distracted and not completing tasks. But why does this happen? Why is there this difference in attention? Well, we don't know for definite, and the specifics are very much an area of debate and ongoing research. But in short, it's thought that the differences in brain structure and chemistry are likely influences. And one thing that gets noted frequently is the neurotransmitter dopamine. So dopamine is made in your brain and acts as a chemical messenger, communicating messages between nerve cells in your brain and across the rest of your body. And it plays a crucial role in regulating various aspects of human behavior. Its effects are complicated, but some key things that it influences include reward and pleasure. So dopamine is released when you experience something rewarding, such as eating something that you really like, receiving praise, or accomplishing a goal. And this reinforces certain behaviors as well, making you more likely to repeat them. Dopamine is also involved in motivation and goal-directed behavior. It can drive you to pursue rewards and take actions to achieve your goals. So when dopamine levels are imbalanced, it can lead to reduced motivation. It also plays a role in mood regulation. So too little dopamine can lead to depression, while too high can lead to overexcitability, impulsivity, and aggression. And dopamine is also involved in the processes of learning and memory. So it helps you associate actions with rewards or consequences, which is essential for adapting and making better decisions in the future. And it's also involved in attention and focus, helping regulate your ability to concentrate on tasks and filter out distractions. And dysregulation of dopamine is thought to be quite common in those with ADHD. In particular, there may be lower levels of dopamine in certain areas of the brain. And some studies suggest that individuals with ADHD may have altered sensitivity in their brain's reward system, meaning they might need higher levels of stimulation or reward to activate their dopamine pathways, which may contribute to them seeking out more stimulating or immediate rewards, and difficulty with delayed gratification. Now, this can make it harder to pursue longer-term goals and can lead to greater impulsivity. Now, in the classroom, this poses some obvious disadvantages. On a neurochemical level, some learning is simply way less interesting or rewarding for a child with ADHD, and sustaining attention on things is literally more difficult. Well, why don't we fix it, you might ask? Give them more dopamine. Why don't we medicate? And it's true, medications commonly used for those with ADHD work by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the brain. And some people with ADHD want to take medication and they find it helpful. But it is important to remember that dopamine dysregulation is not the sole factor contributing to ADHD. We don't have that pinned down. And even if we did, not every person with ADHD will have the same neurochemistry. Some young people may wish to try medication, but it's not for everyone. In fact, for some people, medication may also come with a number of side effects that are unpleasant to manage, and maybe even some side effects that make education harder. So I worked with a wonderful Year 7 student not that long ago who had been taking medication for his ADHD for many years. He was a very articulate young man, very balanced in his thinking, and he told me that his medication helps him focus, but it can make him feel much angrier and made it harder to manage his emotional responses. Specifically, he said to me, either I could work, but I get aggressive and I get in trouble for it, or I'm calmer, but it's harder for me to work and I get in trouble for not concentrating. He ultimately felt that he was in a lose-lose situation. And beyond that, he felt that the medication made him feel much less like himself. And that leads us to thinking about, well, what are the potential advantages and strengths that come with this neurochemical difference? What might we be subduing by changing it? And one thing that comes to my mind is that if you're someone who needs more novelty to get that dopamine kick, you'll seek it. You'll be the person who tries something new, who finds a different way of looking at something, who has a new idea. You may have strengths in your creativity. You may bring passion and energy to really cool new things. A dopamine-seeking person won't want to recreate the old or stick to the status quo or do the same thing again and again. That's not rewarding. They'll be the person offering new ideas, which we need in society. I mean, where would we be if everyone put their heads down and did things the same again and again? We need people who get bored and look for the new. Boredom is the thing that causes the mind to wander, and a wandering mind can breed creativity. So rather than trying to change the child to be more like their neurotypical peers, perhaps we can instead start thinking about what we can do to facilitate their personal skills and allow their differences to be an asset. In learning then, let's turn the questions to ourselves. So if we're teaching young people, how much information are we expecting them to take on? Is it too much? Is it interesting to them? Is it actually too easy? Are they being challenged enough? It's very easy to think that if a child isn't completing something or they're not paying attention, it's because they don't get it. But work that's too easy is also not that rewarding. We could ask ourselves, is the learning new enough? Is it similar to what they've done before? And if so, they may simply switch off because there's zero reward associated with that task anymore. And what else is competing for their attention? Is it external environmental things or thoughts in their head? It's quite possible that they're thinking of something that's way more of a dopamine kick than conjunctions or fronted adverbials. And as much as we want children to listen to us, perhaps there are moments when we need to be humble enough to know that not everything we're saying is gold. And again, I hear you, but Beckett, they need to learn to do some things they don't like, right? They need to listen to some things they find boring. They need to do things that they find hard. That's life. We can't enjoy ourselves all the time. And yeah, sure, children 100% will sometimes have to do things that are not enjoyable. You're right, that is a life lesson. We as adults have to do things that we don't always enjoy. We have to wash the dishes, we have to do the food shop, we have to iron. Or if you hate ironing as much as I do, you have to tactically buy clothes that don't need ironing. There are things that we all have to do that aren't much fun, but they allow us to lead a functional life. However, we do the stuff that we find dull around the stuff that we love. We don't usually spend 6 hours of our day only doing things that give us no joy. Imagine, for instance, ironing for 6 hours a day, and your success as a human is evaluated on how efficiently and well you do it, and how you perform compared to 29 other people who, for reasons that you cannot understand, really love ironing and they're really good at it. You wouldn't sustain it. You'd plateau. You'd give up. So when we're thinking about attention style, we need to think about what we're doing to warrant their attention. How are we buffering the things they find harder with the things that promote their attention and promote their motivation? Okay, so another area related to attention that I want to touch upon is that of organisation and prioritisation, which can be an area notably more challenging within the school context. So those with ADHD, for instance, may have difficulty keeping track of tasks, and they may have difficulty keeping track of their belongings or schedules. They might misplace items, forget dates, or have cluttered workspaces. And they might also find it harder to prioritise tasks effectively, or perhaps get distracted by competing demands along the way. Now, from a learning point of view, that can be a real challenge for kids. So what do we do? Well, as a first point of call, you'll probably draw upon the usual suspects. So things like planning frameworks, checklists, fewer instructions at a time, breaking down learning, and so on. In short, it's a lot of the things that you're probably already doing for a number of your young people. But better still, we want to promote metacognition. And that is promoting a young person's understanding and awareness of how they think and how they learn and what they need to help them. So to have metacognition, you need to know about yourself as a learner. You need to know what kind of factors influence your performance and how you can improve your performance. For example, most adults know what their memory capacity is like. We know when we can hold things in our head or if we need to make a list. And as educators, we can use questions, as shown on the slides, to guide metacognitive thinking with all our pupils. Now, again, this is probably something that you've heard of and something that you do already, but I popped it in because it is something that's helpful for all pupils, including but not limited to children with ADHD. And I've put it in because we're not going to fundamentally change who children are and how they operate, but we can support them to learn about how they think and what they need and help them develop into adults who understand what they need and what works for them. Okay, so another key characteristic associated with ADHD is emotional regulation. And when speaking about dopamine before, I mentioned that it plays a role in mood regulation. So those with ADHD can often feel their emotions very intensely, and we might therefore see children in school become more easily frustrated, upset, excitable, perhaps more impatient than their peers. And as an obvious downside in the school setting, this has implications for learning and engagement. So when we experience intense emotions, our cognitive capacity is, of course, compromised. So a young person who's flooded by emotion will have a much time learning and focusing. Their ability to think rationally at that time will inevitably be compromised. and they may have greater difficulty managing their behaviour. They may well respond in a way that gets them into trouble. And emotional outbursts may also interfere with their friendships and how they're perceived by others. Now, as ever, there's always a flip side. And when thinking about emotionality in those with ADHD, we may also see things like high empathy and care towards others. You might have worked with children who have a real strong sense of justice and passion about what they believe is right and wrong. When tasked with something that they feel emotionally attached to, we may see intense focus and concentration because their emotionality is driving them. So how do we manage this duality? So as with any young person, we would never teach that their emotions are wrong. There's nothing wrong with the intensity at which somebody experiences their emotions. Instead, we teach children how to know their own feelings and help them respond to them in ways that are helpful. And again, there's nothing groundbreaking or new in how we do this. It will be in the things that you're already doing. It will be in the way that you talk about emotions with children. It will be in the systems that you have in place to help them learn about themselves and what they need. The real key is allowing for diversity of emotion and not perceiving high emotionality as being inherently good or bad. Once again, thinking on society as a whole, sometimes we need people who are more sensitive. We need people who feel more outraged by injustice and whose emotionality drives them to change things. At the same time, we want to help children learn healthy ways of holding, processing, and communicating their emotions in a way that's helpful and safe. And a final area I want to at least touch upon, albeit quite quickly, is energy, movement, and sensory style. Now, it's thought that for some people with ADHD, movement can help stimulate the brain, improve concentration, and help to regulate emotions, and it can help them stay engaged and alert. Additionally, movement may increase the release of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, which we've spoken a lot about already, and norepinephrine, which can have a calming and focusing effect. All in all, movement can be a really helpful and healthy mechanism for success for some young people with ADHD. For some kids, little movements may be all they need. Maybe tapping their feet, wiggling their fingers, or fidgeting with an item is enough across a lesson to help them stay on task. Again, not every kid with ADHD will be the same or need the same thing. You may have some young people in your class who need a lot more in terms of movement. And that's where you might be looking at additional movement options where they can get up and move from their seat or take a short walk and so on. In a similar vein, it's common for those with ADHD to have differences in their sensory style, and this might lead to sensory seeking behaviours such as seeking to climb, move, spin, jump, all of which are often coping mechanisms that trigger the release of dopamine. On the other hand, they may also be hypersensitive to some stimuli, such as bright lights, strong odours, textures, which inevitably can impact their concentration as the mind will be distracted by sensory input. And again, it will be a point of reflection to find out what they need and think about this in the context of your classroom. Okay, so in summary, I've spoken about conceptualizations of ADHD and how it sits within the framework of neurodiversity. I've spoken about key elements associated with ADHD, namely attention, organization, and prioritization, emotional regulation, energy, movement, and sensory style. And rather than offer ways of making these characteristics fit with the neurotypical expectations, my aim really has been to help you reflect on why they might not and why that's okay. And when it comes to well, what do we do? As I've said, there is no magic list, and the plan shouldn't sit within one element of one child. yes, you may be working with a child with ADHD, but who they are and what they need is also influenced by things like their personality, their early life experiences, their sense of belonging, or other needs that they may have associated with learning. And further still, their needs are going to be influenced by how these individual factors interconnect with the wider class. How do their individual characteristics interact with the wider class environment and the peers within it? Beyond that, what's your teacher style, and how does that influence the whole class dynamic and how children are able to attend and respond? Again, in the same way that no young person is the same, no teacher is the same either. What your class looks like might feel quite individual to you. And bigger still, how does that sit within the school as a whole? What systems are in place that facilitate the specific dynamics and needs of your class and the individuals within it? Now, this seems big, right? This feels like a lot to think about and a lot to change, but longer term, it's perhaps much more helpful. If we only focus on the individual child, we can find ourselves in situations where we're developing individualized plans and hundreds of strategies for a child on an individual level. And if we operate that way all the time, then in each class we end up with multiple children needing vastly different approaches and really stressed out teachers chasing their tails playing a nightmarish game of whack-a-mole. Focusing at the individual level is really hard to sustain. And it also creates a school environment in which some young people feel like a problem. And going back to what I said at the start, that can lead to some really damaging outcomes for children with ADHD. So like I said, there are no easy fixes and no simple lists, but I hope that through listening to this, you understand why. And as educators, you have a wealth of knowledge and experience. You know how your pupils operate, you know the dynamics of your class, and you know the systems already operating in your school. You also know your own personal style and preferences as a teacher. And that puts you in not an easy position, but the best position to develop ways of working that will be successful and feasible. With that in mind, I'm going to leave you with a reflective activity, and I invite you to work through the following questions, either individually or with your colleagues, to start thinking about the things you've heard within this presentation and bring it together with your own skills and knowledge about your class. My hope will be that through thinking about these questions, you can uncover ways of working that not only work for one child with ADHD, but for your class as a whole and for you as a teacher. So to do that, I invite you to think about a child you work with who has or presents with characteristics relevant to ADHD. And first, think about how you would describe their attention style, their organisation skills, their emotional regulation, and their energy, movement, and sensory style. I then want you to think about what might help them manage their needs in each of these areas, as well as how could their strengths in these areas be promoted. Beyond that, I ask you to think about what other strengths they might have that you feel you could build upon. And then, arguably most importantly, I want you to look at the answers that you've gained from the above questions and think about how might these ideas be used at the whole class level. Again, here we're thinking about feasibility and what that looks like for you as a teacher. And then the final question is, how might wider school systems enable these ways of working? I hope you find it a helpful starting point. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.